Dr. Henry Kissinger speaking to me earlier. Amy Goodman, what did you make of that, and particularly his last point there, that the neighbours of Afghanistan still have an interest in the country? Is that going to be welcomed by the Afghanis, do you think?
Well, first of all, I mean, what the U.S. is doing in Afghanistan and over close to 10 years now, the longest war the U.S. has been involved with. The issue of the U.S. pulling out is absolutely critical. But to hear Dr. Henry Kissinger talking about this or any other issue, I think we have to look at his record. You know, I was broadcasting from just blocks from Ground Zero on September 11th, and we're coming up on the 10-year anniversary of September 11th. We were, interestingly, doing a special that day as the planes were hitting the World Trade Center, looking at the connection between terror and that date, September 11th. But another year, September 11th, 1973, when the Pinochet forces, the U.S.-backed, the Kissinger-backed Pinochet forces rose to power in Chile. That day, Salvador Allende, the democratically elected leader of Chile, died in the palace. Pinochet ruled with an iron hand for 17 years. It was Dr. Kissinger who proudly talked about his support for the Pinochet regime.
Well, he clearly polarizes opinion, Dr. Kissinger, and there's any number of subjects that we could talk about in relation to his foreign policy.
But I think it's very important when we hear his voice to talk about what he has stood for over the decades. You look at Argentina, support for the generals during the Dirty War. You look at Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, how many millions of people died. You look at Timor, which we talked about in the last hour. It was Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, National Security Advisor, and President Ford who gave the go-ahead to Suharto December of 1975 for the Indonesian forces to invade East Timor. I think it's very important to talk about Kissinger's direct role in terror, and I mean that seriously, because of the numbers of people who have died, civilians who have died, that are directly connected to Dr. Kissinger's policies.
Let's bring in Douglas Murray, because I think you've met Dr. Kissinger recently.
I saw him a couple of weeks ago in New York, heard him speak, which is very interesting, at the end of a week, at the beginning of which I'd heard President Obama speaking, and I have to say, also, I have all sorts of criticisms of Henry Kissinger. But one thing you can't take from him is the fact that he thinks in a way, and strategically thinks in a way which is almost entirely alien to this generation of political leaders certainly in the West. I mean, Obama, Cameron, you know, you could list far more, have an almost entirely reactive view in relation to foreign policy. Rarely think, if ever, in any grand strategic terms, and those are the terms which Kissinger always thinks in. And of course there are huge questions over his record, but it's quite hard, if you take the long kind of view that Henry Kissinger does, to, for instance, think that I mean, you see Chile now, thriving economy, the fastest growing, I think, in South America, and you know, it's quite hard to quibble with, if you were taking the long term, some of the decisions that he made.
What did you make of his points about China's potential involvement in Afghanistan, Amy?
I mean, I think we have to look at the utter destruction of this society. $4 trillion the U.S. has put into the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq over the long term. And you think about what has come from that. While President Obama talks about withdrawing troops, great deal has been made of that. He's only talking about withdrawing the number of troops that he committed with the surge. Yeah. He, after the surge, will have more troops in Afghanistan than President Bush at the end of his administration. Well, this is Obama's war.
That's the credit of President Obama. Look, I mean, it depends what you want to achieve in Afghanistan. Afghanistan was a failed state. It was a wrecked society long before British or American troops went in there. The efforts to stabilize and to develop Afghan society, not least Afghan democracy, have been partially successful, but we have been there for almost 10 years now. I would argue there's been an element of mission creep. I agree with Dr. Kissinger's view there, that we have to decide, we have to recalibrate what it is that we want in Afghanistan. I think that we need to go back to the baseline reasons we went in the first place, which is to have whatever troop presence is necessary to ensure that Afghanistan cannot be used as a terror training camp in the way that it was up until September 2001. And that would be the baseline from which I would think we could work. But the idea that that it is all or nothing, that we either completely withdraw, or we allow it, and we allow it to go back to being a terror training camp, or we have the massive deployment of
but
troops.
isn't that the criticism that international other countries look at Afghanistan in terms of what they would like to see happening there? And do we have a clear picture of what Afghans would like?
I mean, no, that is the absolute key question. Whether we're talking about the U.S. presence in Afghanistan or Pakistan, because it's together, and the drone attacks in Pakistan. If the U.S. is concerned about terror, there's nothing that generates the level of anger towards the United States more than the U.S. bombing, whether manned or unmanning, in Pakistan and Afghanistan. The answer is not a military one.
No,
it's shoring up a civilian society through humanitarian
efforts. It's about killing
efforts.
Terrorists who'd kill you if they had the chance. It's about stopping people being able to go across into Pakistan and other countries and destabilize the entire region. It's about not allowing Afghanistan to be the world's terror training central. And to do that, I'm afraid you can't just flood in peacekeepers. You have to kill terrorists, and you have to stop them
And the
having
military
training.
response has worked? The
And
military response has only increased the anger and the rage of the people
that's an
in that area.
unquantifiable thing. It's certainly stopped the spread of terrorism. It's been enormously successful. There are all sorts of attacks that have been stopped completely because of our military's and the American military's involvement in Afghanistan.
I
It's
dare
a huge
say
success in that way.
I dare say the people of Afghanistan tremble when they hear your words,
Well,
Douglas.
no,
because
it's the best chance they have of a civil society. I'm afraid if it had been left alone in the way you clearly wish it had have been, they would still have the Taliban in charge.
right.
Interestingly, in the U.S., Republicans joined with Democrats in condemning President Obama for continuing this war
Which is
in
a
the way
big
they
political
have.
mistake for them to make. They should realize that on this one, Obama's got it right.
And it's been an extraordinary 6 months in world politics, Amy Goodman, and it seems to have started so simply with the actions of this man.
Absolutely remarkable. Mohammed Bouazizi sets himself on fire, and it is the spark that sets off the Tunisian revolution, that then sets off the Egyptian revolution, and you go on through the Middle East. There was another spark as well, and I think it was WikiLeaks, the documents, the U.S. government cables that came out showing that the U.S. knew full well how brutal and repressive the regime in Tunisia was. Now, the Tunisians knew that, but for them to see the U.S. knew it and continued to shore up the despot there, Ben Ali, just further exacerbated the frustration of the people, and they rose up. And then you see the same thing in Egypt, and I think the question that people are asking, I just flew in from the United States here to London, is how is it that these despots survived for so long? Mubarak for 30 years, Ben Ali for even for decades. I mean, they had coats of armor, say Mubarak, that were made in the USA, one of the few things still made in the USA. The U.S. government has given $2 billion a year to Mubarak for decades. More than half of that went to military aid. And these are the serious questions that U.S. government officials have to ask. Whose side do they want to be on? Who is it that they want to protect?
Douglas Murray.
Well, the last 6 months have been seismic. I mean, you've seen for the first time in our lifetimes the addressing of the two major problems across North Africa and the Middle East, which is the terrible lack of democracy and the other side of the same coin, the utterly inequitable distribution of wealth within these societies, the impossibility of any furtherance for people who are born in a low socioeconomic part of their society. So these things have started to be addressed, but I think that it's a bit early to draw some patterns from it, but I think some things are already emerging. I'd say one is that the dictatorships that have gone have been the less bad in the region. And I don't say that with any liking at all for the Ben Ali or Mubarak governments, but let me just put it this way. It seems so far that if you're a dictator who's willing to massacre and gun down your people in as large numbers as you want to, you will stay in power. Look at the regime in Tehran. The less bad ones, like Mubarak and Ben Ali, have been vulnerable. Now, I think that the very bad lesson from this period would be if the worst dictators entrenched themselves further. And that's why I think all of this will be relatively unimportant unless there is an actual changeover of power, an actual democracy in Egypt, Tunisia and elsewhere, and crucially, the fall, finally, of the regional destabilizer, which is the government of Tehran. the revolutionary government of Tehran.
When you look at what's happened in Egypt, there's no question it's an unfinished revolution. I mean, just in the last Fridays, the massive uprisings that continued and the military crackdown on them, because the military remains in power, and the frustration of the people, especially those who lost loved ones during the Tahrir Square uprising, do not see any kind of justice or a process toward justice, toward people being held accountable. And this is a very serious issue for them. Also very important to look at who the United States, President Obama, is calling on to step down, and who he is not calling on to step down. For example, the Al Khalifa regime in Bahrain working with Saudi Arabia and repressing the people of Bahrain. You've got the doctors and nurses that are on trial for simply ministering to those who've been wounded in the protests by the military.
Absolutely. I mean, by its nature, there are huge contradictions going on across the region, and it is extremely difficult for America or any other power to be seen too much to be backing winners or losers or anything like that.
It is seen to be doing that.
Yeah,
isn't
and
it?
I think this is part of the problem. Look,
Americans.
I mean, America will never get this right. No country will ever be able to get this right. It has tried in recent decades to prop up the less bad regimes, and it has had a regional problem for decades, as any country has that would wish to do that. I think the most important thing is that the outcome of these revolutions are seen to be in the hands of the people who started them. And there are all sorts of things that will go wrong along the way, but one important thing, of course, is first of all to dampen expectations of an immediate shift in the whole of the lifestyle of these people, but also, crucially, to keep out of the way. If Western states are seen to be in the way, it'll be part of the problem.